Welcome to episode 3 of The Professor's Record. Tonight I'm joined by Kerry Baldwin. Kerry Baldwin is a philosopher, a libertarian, a Christian theologian. She's a mother. She's got 3 kids. She's got a platform called mereliberty.com where she educates all kinds of people, whether they're middle schoolers, young men and women, and even 40-somethings like myself. I have been the beneficiary of Kerry's keen mind, and my hope is that we actually model how to have a conversation on some really difficult subjects like abortion or doctrinal differences between the church, things that you would avoid at the dinner table. We actually are able to navigate with relative ease, knowing that these are loaded issues. And then we talk about critical thinking, more specifically, Kerry's efforts in teaching critical thinking. So all of this and more coming up. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, David.
Well, we just heard your introduction, and you can find Kerry at mereliberty.com. Though I don't keep in great contact with Kerry because I got off of social media for several years, I've always tried to listen to what Kerry has had to say about a whole host of subjects, and you can find out more about what she's thought about, what she's wrote about at mereliberty.com. Just before we got on together, I shared with her that I think what I appreciate most about Kerry is her willingness to talk about very, very difficult subjects that you typically wouldn't talk about at the dinner table, whether it's what does a free society look like, libertarianism, theology, and yet those are subjects that I'm really fond of talking about, especially when you can do it with really, really smart people. So, Kerry, welcome to episode 3 of The Professor's Record. Thank you for giving me your time. And so my first question is this: who are you?
Who am I? Well, I am a Christian woman who loves challenging paradigms. That's what I do. I have a degree in philosophy, which I earned, 2015. I'm a divorced mother of 3, and I have spent a lot of my life asking lots of questions and being just sort of naturally inquisitive and asking why do things work the way they work? Why do we do things the way we do things? And I haven't that inquisitive nature hasn't ever been from, well, I shouldn't say ever, but hasn't typically been from like a rebellious streak, just really wanting to understand the way the world works and why. And so yeah, I got into philosophy mostly because of that inquisitive nature. I knew that I almost went into political science, and I knew that I was the kind of person who would challenge my professors. And so I thought that philosophy might be the better way to go. And I have absolutely no regrets. It was probably one of the better decisions that I've ever made. So
Really quick, a lot of folks have ideas of what a philosophy education looks like.
mm-hmm.
If you had to draw a thumbnail sketch of what tools that degree gave you, in one, you think they were, did you receive a good education, would you say? Or, because when I think of philosophy, I think of logic, how to apply logic, how to problem solve. Most lawyers that I know a lot of them were philosophy majors, and because they wanted to prioritize their ability to be very logical and consistent in their arguments. So what can you share about your experience with philosophy?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I mean, the logic side is certainly interesting, but I think that my motivation for studying philosophy has to do with how everything in the world actually works together. We've got all these different fields of knowledge. We have, the field of law, we have the field of psychology, we have the field of sociology, biology, mathematics. Like, how do all of these things work together? And that's what I'm really interested in, because one of the things that I have learned about myself personally is I'm I'm an INTJ on the MBTI. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I am, but explain that to those that are watching.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the MBTI is based on, it's the Myers-Briggs. Gosh, I don't know what the TI stands for. Anyways, it's Myers-Briggs personality test. It's based off of Carl Jung's work on cognitive processes. And so at any rate, there are, I think, 16 different types of personalities. And when I took the MBTI test, I came out as an INTJ, which is very, very rare. I think it's the most rare, or second most rare, for women. And it really answered some questions for me.
Well, when you say NITJ, give us the
Yes.
Those are initials representing different traits that you have as far as your personality.
Yeah. So INTJ, I is introverted, N is intuitive, T is thinking, J is judgmental, although it's not the negative connotation of the word judgmental. It just means that I like to form conclusions rather than leave things ambiguous. And so, yeah, that's basically the idea there with the INTJ. The INTJ is somebody who really likes to contemplate about the way the world works and come up with ideas, conjecture about the way those things work. There was one guy who studies Carl Jung. He has a YouTube channel. He explained it as my trying to find, the INTJ tries to find the most, how did he put it now? Well, basically the INTJ is looking at a bunch of ideas and trying to figure out the trajectory of all those ideas. How do they all work together? So I can contemplate a lot more ideas in my head as a result of these cognitive processes.
Yeah. Last week, I asked Jason Rink kind of a similar question about whether he's ever looked at some of these psychological profiles. And I love them in part because I think it helps me understand not only my own vulnerabilities or weaknesses, but to try to understand the person that I'm talking to.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've faced the same temptation of trying to get other people to figure out what they are so you can better understand them.
Yeah.
And I've naturally gravitated towards the Enneagrams just because there is the labels, or the numbers, if you will, are very, very archetypical in the sense that you kind of have an idea by just the titles. You're a reformer, or you're a helper, or you're a protagonist, or you're an analyst. And I think people can form an idea in their head about who they think a helper is or an achiever is, rather than the kind of the initials that you'll find in the Myers-Briggs test.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to take every one of these tests that I can, at least the free version, but
Right.
I paid like $10 to do one of the personality tests over at Understanding Myself with the big 5 traits.
Yes.
And it was wonderful feedback. And what's really cool is that there's a lot of science that went into figuring out where I lie in comparison to maybe 100 other people with respect to openness or volatility or intelligence, or so all of those things. And so I kind of asked you a very, very broad question, but I've seen some of your writings where you really focus on maybe the benefits or challenges of being someone who's introverted.
Mhm.
And maybe you can speak to how you've either overcome that challenge, if you even perceive it as a challenge, or why is it something that you think where you've actually taken the time to articulate your thoughts on what it means to be an introvert?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question. For so many years, I thought that introversion was sort of a social deficiency. And we live in an extroverted world. And so, it's sort of, we all have this idea that success is going to be based on how gregarious you are. And I read a book by a woman named Susan Cain, named or called Quiet. Um, and I forget the subtitle, but it's about the power of introverts and what we actually contribute to society. Um, and so, you know, when I took that MBTI and discovered some of the traits of introversion, I sort of had this aha moment. It was like, oh, this is actually a skill for me. This is a talent for me. This is something that I can use to contribute to society instead of sitting here, saying, "Oh, I wish I, could do what that person could do." Um, so at any rate, once I realized it was a gift, and realized, like, for example, one of the, you know, introverts are often thought of as being socially awkward or shy. We tend to only have a handful of very close friends, but those friendships are very deep. And so we know how to build very deep, long lasting friendships. Um, we also have a tendency to, um, reach out to the outcast, those people who haven't really found their niche or don't fit into any sort of box. And so we're very good at being able to reach out to those people who haven't figured themselves out and allow themselves to be comfortable figuring out who they are and that sort of thing. So um
You're able to perceive or look around a room and
mhm,
figure out quite a bit. If we use the Enneagram model, there are different affinities between personality types, and so you talked about being introvert as a strength,
mhm,
and I'd echo that. A lot of, I would call, fives, who are the analysts.
mhm,
A lot of them are introverts, and it's not that they're shy.
mhm.
It's just that they don't feel like formulating or discussing out loud a concept until they've fully mastered it.
Right. Exactly.
And so as an eight, or someone who's a protagonist, I feel like I've got a high intuition on. I feel like I can make a pretty quick judgment on what's going on,
Mhm,
but I am more likely to say something without having completely mastered it.
mhm.
And so if I'm on and I hit my marks, well, then I come off being someone who must be really, really intelligent. But there are times where that's a weakness, and then I'll put my foot in my mouth. And I've tried so hard over the past 20 years to pause
Mhm.
and not be as extroverted or volatile. It's still something that I struggle with. But one of my, I would say my best friends are all introverts, because I get to learn from
Mhm.
them so I can better articulate what needs to be said. And it's kind of cool that most of the fives or analysts that I've come across enjoy being around eights that are extroverts, because sometimes when they get it right, they say things that they want to say, but they don't,
Yeah.
because they haven't met their kind of their standard of perfection.
Yeah.
Um, and so eights and fives do really well together. And maybe that's something that you've also observed um, in your studies.
Yeah, I'm not so familiar with Enneagram. I haven't taken the Enneagram, but I've learned about the Big Five and I've learned about MBTI, and I do think that there's something to be said about certain traits uh, that might otherwise be considered opposite really working well together. Um, and I think that also comes from a bit of maturity. One thing that I've learned, or I've observed rather, is that some people will take these personality tests as being sort of astrological, like, oh, this is who I am, and it can't be moved. I'm oh, I only make a few friends, and so I've already got my few friends. I can't be friends with, like, it's like,
That's
no.
true. But
you
you can
know
take those tests if you're working on, I guess, your perceived weak points or deficiencies.
yeah,
If you
yeah.
can move the needle on those tests. I've retaken a lot of these tests, and I'm like,
Hmm.
and I try to, I think I'm being authentic when I'm answering those questions because I really been trying to work on
Hmm.
areas that I don't like.
Yeah.
And I mean, sometimes you can change your behavior and come
Hmm.
to a genuine change in the way that you interact with the world.
Yeah.
Um, Let me ask you this. So we've been spending some time on just the world of personality tests, and I
Sure.
don't know. I doubt anyone else is going to be as excited about it as we are. But when it comes to problem solving or communicating or advocating, you've written on a whole host of subjects on your platform. I've seen them, I've read them, I've listened to some of your discussions talking about, um, you know, controversial issues like abortion with Walter Block. I've heard some of your theological um, positions with respect to really prominent pastors like John Piper. Um, I mean, you do not shy away from engaging with um, topics that most people would just say, look, I don't want to offend anyone. And I don't think you offend anyone in the way that you present yourself, but there's certainly a chance for conflict
Yeah.
with your audience. And so could you share with our audience how you arrived at this place where you felt like you could share your insights about things that are really hard to talk about?
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things that I learned about myself was that I enjoyed both theology and philosophy. And, those are sort of like the two overarching, most prominent sciences. One is talking about the structure of reality. That's philosophy. How do all these things hang together? And then the other one, theology, is talking about whether there is a supernatural power out there that has something to do with this. And I saw both of those things being, um the two topics that we don't generally talk about in a free society, but they're of the greatest necessity to talk about. Um, and so, at any rate, I think very broadly speaking, those are two areas of study that I'm just naturally drawn to. The particulars, as far as what I've studied, what I've written upon, are really very close to me personally, for one or more reasons. The abortion issue, I've never had an abortion. Um, I grew up in the pro-life movement. Grew up with parents who were very active in the pro-life movement, and it wasn't until I came to realize I was in an abusive marriage, experiencing poverty, that I finally kind of took a step back and said, okay, wait a second. Maybe we should start listening to women about why they're having these abortions, because we don't need to condone it, but at the same time, if they're giving us reasons why they're seeking it out, then maybe listening to them will help us find
Mm.
an actual solution. And so,
I'm so glad that you said that because even for couples that haven't had to struggle through a difficult divorce, especially one that's abusive,
mhm,
um, pregnancy's scary, even when
Yeah.
everything's going right, even when
Right.
you have the financial wherewithal,
Yeah.
when you might have a good spell. I don't think any couple has it's hard to maintain a loving relationship all the times. For me and my wife, I think we have kind of quarterly fights where it's just going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
The setting has been primed,
Mm-hmm.
and even when you want to have children, all of these things happen where um, I can only imagine if I was 17 years old, single, broken family life, and I came from a very, very dysfunctional family where we never talked about abortion. It was this
Mm-hmm.
abstract thing.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have any firm convictions about it one way or the other growing up because it wasn't real to me. As a teenage boy, it's like, what do I have to worry about it? And it wasn't
Yeah.
until I was much older and experienced fatherhood and you look at what a woman has to go through that you're going, my God, this is the reality
Yeah.
that someone's facing. It doesn't help to be so just to have your position, your working statement of this or that. And so what you're hitting on is really important because it gets into the reality of the situation as opposed to just a bumper sticker slogan
Right.
on why you're right, why you're wrong. And it really doesn't address the underlying root causes of how we got there or got to that position where someone's making a decision that could be, well, we'll say it's catastrophic for the child, but it could also be psychologically catastrophic for the young
Mm-hmm.
woman that's making it. And if
Yeah.
if the only thing that we can offer is, well, condemnation,
Yeah.
where's the redemption? Where's the hope for someone to embrace a pro-life movement? So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think you're headed there with what you were about to say before I interrupted you. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to. I certainly just don't want you to feel like you're stepping on my toes with your views, because I think the instinct for many is to just, well, what's there to talk about?
Mm-hmm.
So could you perhaps give me an example of something that would be helpful in that discussion, in that space on abortion? And then maybe we can touch on a few other areas that you've had similar kind of paradigm shifting discussions.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, I think part of what has really influenced the development of my ideas on abortion was also coming out of that abusive marriage and really really identifying the things that I needed in order to get to a place where I could support myself and support my kids. And so one of one of the revelations, I guess you might say, that I pointed out in my debate with Walter Block is that one of the reasons why we still have conflict on this issue of abortion is because both sides are compromising rights. The conservative pro-life view is compromising women's rights uh, in favor of the fetus, and the feminist side, the pro-choice side, is compromising the rights of the fetus in favor of the woman. And what that ultimately says is that the rights of women and children are at odds with one another, and
Mm.
I don't accept that. I absolutely don't accept
Wow,
that.
that's helpful.
Uh,
Uh,
Um, yeah.
so where do you draw the line on how to navigate the line between those rights? Because I think you're spot
Mhm.
on.
Yeah.
It's their rights or it's my rights.
hmm Well, one of the problems that we run into with the abortion debate is that there are two arguments going on at the same time. There's the ethical argument and then the legal rights argument, and we mix those two up. Um, I don't make an ethical argument. What's sort of very stereotypical even of libertarians is that um, we've arrived at this conclusion that um, just because something is unethical doesn't necessarily mean it should be illegal. And when I started focusing on only the legal rights aspect, how do we actually identify these rights? Where do we draw that line? I think I was able to make some progress. So I use Murray Rothbard's formulation of human rights as expressed as property rights. And so I've got 2 episodes on my podcast talking about how the fetus is a self-owner, and they have self-ownership, and that happens right from the moment conception is complete, and conception takes about 3 days. That's something else that we don't tend to think about. But when I started formulating that argument and really drawing those lines with figuring out, okay, when does the baby have self-ownership? Let's absolutize this and see what happens. Then a whole bunch of other things started falling into place. Like, we don't actually know, and maybe you can attest to this, we don't actually know what rape is. We don't have a way to actually define rape. We say that it's non-consensual sex, but any woman out there will tell you that doesn't quite do it. And I think that if we absolutize fetal rights, we absolutize women's rights, and we can actually figure out what rape is. We can, and as it turns out, I think it's worse than murder. And it's an invasion. It's like a literal invasion, right? Yeah. It's an invasion. It's theft. It's abuse. It's all of those things wrapped into one. And when we see murder on a mass scale, we're abhorred by it. When we see theft on a mass scale, we're abhorred by it. And we know what it is. But when we see rape on a mass scale, we don't actually know what it is, because it's not always obvious to us. But if we think of invasion and usurpation of property and all of these things that I've spoken about on my podcasts and with Walter Block, do you
think Walter was a willing learner or recipient of your views? What was your sense of how he took your arguments? And I've got a few other questions that I want to just dial in.
Sure. Yeah. Walter's great. I really like Walter. He's worked really hard on his own theory of eviction. And his aim is similar to mine. It's to come up with a libertarian view of abortion. And of course, he takes a slightly pro-choice. He wouldn't call it pro-choice. He calls himself pro-life. I think he's receptive insofar as he's seeking out the truth. And
do you think that you had any effect on his thinking in the debate? Do you think that was an argument where he's like, there's a new wrinkle that Kerry, that you provided that I'm going to have to reevaluate some things. Do you think that happened?
I'm not sure that he's at the point of reevaluation, and I still need to write my formal paper. He asked me to write a formal paper and submit it. 2020 sort of, put that on the back burner. But, I think that he would be receptive to a well thought out idea. And I think that some of the challenges that have been given to him, I don't think they're quite well thought out in that they mirror the conventional conservative pro-life view too much. Like, he and I would both agree that the current paradigm just doesn't work. Both pro-choice people and pro-life people have gotten it wrong.
I had an opportunity to hear Walter Block when I was a delegate. I went to Tampa, and Walter Block was one of Ron Paul's guests. And I'll give him this. He's got the courage to provide kind of an unorthodox view, even at least among pro-life Republicans. Yeah. I think there's an audience within the Libertarian Party that's pro-choice that aren't bothered by his views at all. But in the context of the place that he gave a speech, there were people that were loudly booing him because, again, they couldn't understand that there's a lot of needed nuance on how to, if you want to solve the pro-life problem,
Yeah.
you better hear some of the objections out. And so one of my follow-up questions to you is, when you talked about a fetus having self-ownership at conception, 3 days, I've heard this example, and perhaps this is a good one, or maybe you'd push back against this. The idea of, when we're talking about property rights, the landlord tenant paradigm comes up, or analogy, where you have concurrent rights, but you define them like, you're going to pay me rent, and I'm going to let you live here, and I'm going to make sure that the place that you get to live is habitable. And that doesn't directly translate, because then there's this idea of someone that's unwanted. Maybe you don't want that tenant in there, and perhaps you're culpable in allowing the tenant to show up in your property or at your property. And I guess the question from a legal standpoint that I've come down on is, all right, someone doesn't have the right to be at a residence, and we'll just keep using the property language for now. And I should be able to ask them to leave or evict them if they're violating some of the rules that we've drafted through a contract. Abortion's a little bit more difficult to fit into that category, and it seems like you really have to talk about the rights of a trespasser in some ways. And some people would push back on that immediately. What do you mean? People make decisions when they make love or when they have intercourse. And so you can't dumb it down and say, well, I didn't want this. It's like, well, if you take on certain behavior, there is a probable outcome with pregnancy. But in the law, there's this old case that dealt with some teenagers that used to just ransack a guy's cabin out in the woods. And at some point, the owner of the cabin set up a spring gun that was tied to the doorknob of this door. And wouldn't you know, one of these kids broke into the cabin again and triggered the spring gun, and it shot him. And so the case decision basically established this rule of law, that you have a right to defend your property. You have a right to do these things, but you can't use deadly force in preserving that right. And that wasn't something that was ever talked about in the abortion context, but it was very helpful for me to go, you do have competing rights. But what's the remedy?
Yeah. So, well, there's a number of things that I think are very different from a trespass scenario. When I argued with Walter Block, I argued that a fetus cannot be considered a trespasser. And part of the reason why I argued that was because in any other situation, even the case that you just brought up, you have human beings, rights-bearing individuals who are actually crossing a boundary line, right? They've originated from outside that boundary line. Their property is elsewhere, and they're crossing a boundary. Now, I do actually believe in lethal self-defense, and I think that just translates, as far as the abortion debate is concerned, I think that translates over when the fetus is actually threatening the mother's life. But as far as any other situation, what you have with a fetus is a fetus didn't have a choice to be brought into existence, right? Conception is a natural consequence, or a potential natural consequence, of intercourse. And we make choices and decisions in everything we do. And every choice and decision we make comes with a degree of risk, some degree of risk. And, when a woman takes contraception, she is trying to mitigate that risk, but it doesn't eliminate that risk. And in any other decision that we make, we know that we are not free from the consequences of our choices. And there's also a concept in tort law that if you harm another person's property or whatnot, they have a proprietary interest in restitution from you, because they didn't have they didn't have a choice to not get violated by you.
Have you thought of, so I hate to interrupt you, but have you
Yep.
thought if the landlord tenant trespasser analogy doesn't work, is there something that you could share with me that perhaps would be more on point? It's almost the only thing I can think of here just on the spot would be like being a poor soul that ends up being taken hostage. It wasn't their choice, and then someone's going to have a dispute of whether or not you can use their building while someone's negotiating for your life. Which, I can think of a lot of reasons why this would break down really quickly, but it's like, yeah, I'm in danger. I don't really want to be here. I really had nothing to do with the circumstances as to why I'm here, but I don't want my life to be held in ransom one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's very much more like the rape situation. And one of the things that I pointed out with the rape situation was, if we absolutize fetal rights, then what happens in rape is not just non-consensual sex, right? It's forcing a woman to use her means of production to produce something that she doesn't want to produce. And when we say, oh, abortion should be permitted in that case because she shouldn't have to go through that, what we're giving her is crumbs from the table. We're allowing the rapist to get off easy. And in fact, the sexual revolution was, a lot of people want to blame that on second wave feminism, but it wasn't second wave feminists. It was a group of men who wanted to get off the hook for inadvertently causing pregnancies they didn't want to take responsibility for. So, if we actually absolutize fetal rights and we understand what is going on, that a woman's means of production is being used against her will to produce something that puts a burden on her, then suddenly what we can see, if we're looking at it in terms of restitution, is that rapist owes her and that baby a ton of money. Because that, the restitution fits the crime. And
it's interesting that you said that, because that's actually very holistic in another way. There are a lot of men that while they might have made a mistake in influencing intercourse under, usually there's some drinks involved. Usually people's inhibitions are down, and in a moment of passion, no one was thinking about what could happen nine months down the road. But I've also seen scenarios where men are willing to take responsibility. Now, that's not what you hear, but men are willing, and they want that child, and they can't, under the law, advocate for the very thing that you're saying, which is give us money or give us support or give us something because of what you did. I'm not talking about rape so much, but I'm talking about, let's say that there was a consensual sex, or shame on both for doing something to lower their inhibitions to the point where they deprive themselves of being intelligent before they had intercourse. Because what we're seeing, at least in the legal system, is there are a lot of men that want that child to live as well, not in the rape context, but in this context.
Yeah.
And I think your thesis would actually promote a right for the father, not just from a monetary standpoint, but from there's different types of damages, like hedonic damages,
Mm-hmm.
the way to relate, love, emotional.
Mm-hmm.
So we provide a monetary equivalent that's tied to all of these different harms.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that thought, or where am I off base?
Well, I'm not entirely certain. And I'm very familiar with the fathers' rights movement. And, I have a soft spot for it because especially knowing the damage that a bad father can do to his children, I know the great benefit that a good father can
Mm,
do. And so I don't want to I don't want to minimize that, but at the same time, I think that what my view actually ends up if you sort of step back and pan out at sort of the bigger picture, what we see is that starting with the woman has choices to make. Men also have choices to make, and we also very much know what that heat of passion is like, and that should cause us to step back and really think about those relationships, right? A woman owns the means of production. She owns the ultimate means of production, which is producing new humans.
mm,
Um, a man owns resources from nature. When those two come together, we create a new product. And I'm using that in the economic sense just to help paint a picture of what's happening. But in order for me, as the owner of my means of production, to make a decision about which resource to allow to mix with that, I've got to make some decisions. And I think the downside, and maybe this is something that men need to think about. I think the downside to producing a child, even unwittingly, out of wedlock, really calls into question whether or not the father can have a claim on that child. If you, let's say, you visit your friend's home and you leave your wallet or your house keys in your friend's home on accident and leave, and they also leave, you're at the mercy of your friends, and whenever they're able to get back to their house, you don't have a right to break into their house and take the keys just because it's yours. So I think that there's something to be said about a woman's bodily autonomy, and if that exists, then it should cause us to really reevaluate how we're conducting our relationships. And that goes outside of libertarianism and the legal perspective on things. But as I look at the dating world, I mean, this is from a personal perspective. As I look at the dating world, it's a mess. So this should really this gets into the sociology of it. How are we actually conducting our relationships? And maybe we need to actually step back and think about that as a culture,
Oh,
because
I
it
think that's
used,
I think that's great. Curious, because
yeah,
the sad thing is, you know, we don't expect 18-year-olds to be having this conversation that we're having right now.
right.
And sadly, we need to create a society where this is the type of conversation that happens,
Yes.
you know, in your formative years.
Hmm.
And this kind of dovetails into your thought about the choices that you have. And I
Yeah.
would agree with you. It's not enough for a man to just be able to say, I have a claim because I
Hmm.
have resources.
Right.
Um, the way that you make that potential life together is by really making yourself more attractive, a more attractive option to the means of production, which would be,
Yeah.
hey, I know that I'm a jackass. I know that I've got a job at Domino's Pizza, and I
Yeah.
know right now my merely asserting my claim that I should be in this child's life and in your life. Well, you can say it, but that's not real life. Real life is, I don't know
Mhm.
if, I mean, we're talking about a human being here.
Yeah.
And if I'm going to be primarily responsible for carrying this baby to term, raising it, nurturing it, and not just nurturing it, but like, physically feeding it,
Hmm.
um, then yeah, I think the right of the man breaks down pretty quickly. And any father who's had to change diapers or pretend that you're asleep so your spouse would get up to do that knows that this is not just something that you can pithily
Yeah.
say, I got that right. So for the men out there listening to this, um, if you're going to make that claim, I sure hope that you're willing to take the responsibility that comes with
Yeah.
being someone that your spouse or your future spouse would actually want to spend the rest of their life with. And in most cases, I feel so terrible for women in what the choice is. And I'm speaking for about myself too, as a young 20 something, of just, my goodness, uh,
Yeah.
the degree of wisdom that you can acquire after having a daughter, or seeing something so precious and going, I would scream if
Yeah.
my daughter met anyone remotely like me when I was 18 years old.
Right.
Um,
Well, and I want to say something about women too, because women, and this is especially true of feminism and the pro-choice movement, which is this idea that pregnancy is something that is outside of our control. Like that's the argument, is pregnancy isn't our fault, and so we should be able to have an abortion. But the reality is that especially if we're absolutizing fetal rights and absolutizing women's rights, um, women have a great deal of power over their bodies. They're the gatekeepers. From an evolutionary perspective, they're the sex selectors. And that means we're the ones who get to say, yes or no, whether or not sex happens. If we say no, guess what, guys? Not obeying that, not conceding to that no, is a crime.
mhm.
So women hold a great deal of power, and men, interestingly enough, will compete for a woman, especially if she's, worth her weight. Um, and so, uh, all of this discussion about abortion and women's rights and all of that, if we absolutize fetal rights, we have to talk about all this other stuff.
Mhm.
And I think it's empowering to women. I think that it would also be empowering to men. I think that it would contribute to, the conversation about masculinity and femininity in our culture, which right now is being erased um, by this transgender movement. Let's acknowledge who and what we are and what we are capable of doing. And that actually gives us a great deal of power.
Wow. Well, let me try to segue, not so, it's hard to go. I think if anything, boy, the toughest
Yeah.
discussion of probably all of them. And what I love about what you're sharing is again, there's this paradigm shifting, not so much about the conclusion or requiring, someone to agree with you, but we're able to have a healthy discourse between the extremes,
Hmm.
and perhaps figure out how to voluntarily move the needle in the appropriate direction. Since we talked about one thing that you would never talk about at the dinner table, let's move on to the next one, which would be
Okay.
theology.
Oh, yeah.
Because I sense in you, because of you sharing, being a mother of three,
Hmm.
someone who's gone through a divorce, that, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but this is just my sense of, just because I've thought about, what does church feel like
Hmm.
for the person where they weren't able to acquire, I guess, the domestic postcard of, this is what a Christian family looks like when they walk into the church. And even the way that preachers preach or evangelists evangelize, there are kind of goals for the family, what it looks like, goals for the role of men, the role of women. And I always thought, well, what a great sermon if you've got that postcard, but what if you come from some abusive place, or what if you come from a place where um, through maybe no fault of your own, you can't get that postcard, and
Mhm.
you're sitting there in the pew, and how are you encouraged? How are you ministered to in a way where you feel like you have the same fullness of the message of the gospel as these intact families? And so if that is something that you, I don't know, maybe identify with, or if I'm getting close to the mark,
Yeah.
um, what could you tell our audience about someone that comes from where you come from? Because you're still a person of strong faith.
Yeah.
And you've never struck me as someone that's actually watered down their theology to make excuses for what Scripture demands of us. In fact, you kind of run towards Scripture
Mm.
as a defense. So could you talk about maybe some of the things that might surprise our viewers on just your theological positions?
Well, that is such an interesting question. I'll tell you, first of all, the vast majority of single mothers do not attend church. And the reason why they do not attend church is because it's because of exactly what you said, um, but not just the sermons being geared towards the idyllic nuclear family. Um, but there is this sense, and I have experienced this personally. There is this sense that if you're a single mother, you brought it on yourself,
Mm.
and um, you are deficient in some way. Um, you need somebody else to make decisions for you. Um, I'm theologically, I'm a Calvinist. And that is probably more conservative than most conservative evangelicals are comfortable with. You know, I still believe in doctrines of hell and original sin and those sorts of things. I currently attend a Lutheran church. I grew up in the Lutheran church, the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. I currently attend a Lutheran church as their resident Calvinist, because my Calvinist church turned spiritually abusive. And they did that by trying to usurp my authority as a mother, as a parent. And they did that because I was absent and a husband.
Mm.
And they didn't agree with the way I was handling my children. Um, you know, I've I've seen both sides of that coin. The church that I attend now demonstrates Christian love, and this does dovetail with the abortion issue quite nicely, because if you want those mothers to keep those babies, um, they need the support and not the condemnation, not the stigma, none of that. And most churches, especially most conservative churches, don't have those resources available for single mothers. Um, some of the more liberal churches have resources, but in my opinion, are lacking in a depth of theology. Um, the gospel itself uh, that has been my lifeblood.
Mm.
There's absolutely no way around that. It is my lifeblood. I could not survive without it. But I also would not be able to survive with the Christian love in the church that I'm attending now. Um, so it's both good doctrine
Wow.
and Christian love.
That's helpful to hear, because I'm, if I had to describe myself, I would say that I'm like Presbyterian, like elements of Presbyterian, Baptist, Lutheran, and that which would shock every one of them that hold their doctrine dear, and many of them do. Um, but one of the things that I've become wary of is when someone's love of theology or their doctrine actually is greater than their love of God.
Mm,
And so I try to think of people that are so profoundly graceful and loving and maybe not able to articulate the finer points of theology, yet they live it out in a way that's just so profound. My mother, I would say, is an example of that. I don't even know if she's a Christian, but she's someone that loves unconditionally. And then my dad, who I would say there's a bit of a chasm between us, is very, well, or was very legalistic and could tell you everything that you need to know. But I seldom found the grace and the godly living that I experienced from my mother. And so my experience at different churches was, I'm looking for an authentic experience where when you talk about someone like Jesus of Nazareth, that I feel an affinity towards him.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't manufacture that through your sermons, why am I here? Because ultimately the highest calling is to love God, and how we get there. And so what I've seen is in many services, there's something to a Baptist evangelist that gets you there. And then there's things that irritate me terribly about those services. And then I'll go to, a Presbyterian church that I've been a member of, and the doctrine's great, but there's such theological manipulation at times to where the resources are so great that you can preach a comfort gospel where you've calibrated everything to where there's no boldness, there's no requirement to go out, there's no urgency. If anything, it's the exact opposite. Don't treat the world as an urgent battlefield that you need to get out into. And so I feel like I've been treading water at a church that I think's got really good doctrine. But it's interesting that you said that you're going to a Lutheran church. So am I, and I'm not a member of this Lutheran church.
Oh my gosh!
But but unbeknownst to me, I ended up going to some of these community groups trying to figure out what to do with some of the mask mandates that I feel are just so excessive.
Yeah.
But my church was basically in lockstep with the mandates of the governor. And that really bothered me because, well, either you are operating under the jurisdiction of Jesus Christ or you're not. And it looked like they were operating under the jurisdiction of the state. And so everything that our governor would say, they followed. And I just couldn't abide by that. So I ended up in one of these community groups, came across him. I didn't know was a pastor. But he was just the loveliest person, just a rock. And then I found out later he was a pastor, and I said, well, what are you doing about your services? And he said, oh, we never shut down. Never. And I'm not going to mention who this is because I want him to continue to operate without any retribution. Sure. But I think when our lockdown started, it was in April. And that was really the week of our Easter service. And he said something that was very profound. How can I preach about the resurrection if we're all living in fear? And in fact, if this is as bad as everyone thinks, I have to be out there sharing the gospel to ensure that if souls perish, that they'll have eternal life. And I'm like, okay, that's the boldness that I haven't been hearing. And so we've attended, and this, you want to talk about conservative, there are conservative churches. This one is like, it's very liturgical. All the hymns are old, and something that I probably would have run from 10 years ago because I want some level of accessibility. What I'm finding is that the old wisdom, the old hymns, the modesty, the humility, it's been what I've needed and what our families needed. To where we're looking at this church, and we want to come to it in a way where we're not just mailing it in and saying, okay, I just want to have a home, because they practice close communion. So I've gone without communion since April.
Oh man.
And I want it, but I also want to make sure that the church that I'm going and I are on the same page. And I think where we're at right now is that without getting into the weeds on transubstantiation or all these other terms that are just huge, is I think if we can allow each other to have a little bit of mystery as to what's going
Yeah.
on, then that might be our church home going forward.
Mm,
So it's just one of those things where I would invite any of the folks that watch this that are being challenged with their circumstances with their church. I think one of the silver linings of COVID is that if you've had a weak gospel preached to you, you're not
hmm.
preaching now, or you're not preaching with God's sovereignty in mind.
Yeah.
And so what I'm hoping for is that there's great revival for these churches that never lost sight of the
Yeah. Yeah.
jurisdiction of Jesus.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's just so interesting that you said that. I'm like, that's me. I'm doing the same thing.
Yep. Yeah. I have not had communion since I left my Presbyterian church. And, it's been interesting because, we've compared Augsburg Confession and Westminster, and, gosh, if there's one thing that I have definitely been able to cement in my mind is that I do confess the Westminster Confession. Um, but nonetheless, right now my home away from home is this Lutheran church, and they've been absolutely wonderful. I love them dearly.
Hmm. So with the amount of time that you'll allow me,
Hmm.
what I'd like to do is, I think if anything, we've modeled discourse on two very
Yes.
difficult decisions, or two difficult subjects to get people to agree on. In fact, I'm sure many people that watch this video will say, "Oh, you're both wrong. You're not Catholic," or you know, well, yeah,
Right.
that was boring. When you
Yeah.
talked about a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
Um, but let's talk about the subject of critical thinking, because you're doing some
Yes.
work on critical thinking,
Hmm.
and so tell us what you're up to and why it might be of great importance to the world that we live in right now.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Last year, uh, I decided after the lockdown, I decided to develop a course on critical thinking. It's actually a Socratic seminar, which I'm sure you are very familiar with the Socratic method. Um, and I developed these courses for middle schoolers, high schoolers, and adults. And I did it sort of as a response to the school lockdowns and things like that, where kids were sent home and suddenly parents were having to deal with a homeschooling situation that they were not ready for. Um, I've been a homeschooler. I was homeschooled myself as a child, and of course, I've got this this degree and some knowledge of how to actually think critically. And so I just decided, you know what, I'm gonna create this course. And so that's what I did. They are let's see, 15-week sessions, so basically the length of a semester, where we use the Socratic method to teach the skills of critical thinking. Um, but the topics up for discussion are the principles of a free society. And so, whether you're my mid school students or my adult students or my high school students, we're all talking about very fundamental ideas of what it means to live in a free society. Um, and they've been absolutely wonderful conversations. And so the Socratic method, for those in your audience who don't know, it's a form of dialogue, which it starts out by asking questions. There are some what I call offshoots of the method known as dialectic. I think sophistry also falls under that if you use it correctly. Um, and I also consider autodidactics or self-directed learning as an offshoot of the Socratic method. But during those 15 weeks, um, we spend the first few weeks doing a lot of self-reflection and coming to understand yourself and evaluating your own thinking. We do some personality tests. Um, my one of my favorite lessons with the middle school students is asking what is an idea. And so we go through the discussion of what an idea is, which is a very abstract sort of thing.
What
With
is it?
yeah, it's I actually use this TED talk from Adam Savage. He's the one of the Mythbusters guys, and so he talks about how big ideas start from simple questions, and he goes over 4 different scientists that he found very influential in his own life. And so, like we talk about Galileo, right? And he discovered a number of things. One of the things that we talk about is the big mistake that he made with trying to calculate the speed of light. But we discuss, how did that start? Like, why did he decide to try and figure out what the speed of light was? Well, he asked this question. I wonder how quickly light travels, right? Same thing with Richard Feynman. He says that his whole career in physics started with a basic question about why the ball in his wagon when he was a child goes to the back of the wagon when he pulls it forward. And so, I like helping kids sort of connect those simple questions to these big ideas, and that they develop over time. And the kids love it. The kids, they're just, their mind gets turned on and they absolutely eat it up.
So is this an alternative for homeschool or something that works alongside homeschoolers? What's the marketplace for what you're talking about? Because obviously
Yeah.
what I prioritize, at least with my students, is you have to be a critical thinker and a problem solver to navigate just how difficult life is. And so I don't really concern myself about whether someone leaves my law class memorizing the elements of a contract, so
Right.
much as I want you to be able to think and process information in a way that allows you to survive
Yeah.
in what can be a very brutal world. And it sounds like you're asking all of these questions of your students, or challenge them to ask the right questions. So what's the marketplace?
So, yeah, this is geared mostly towards, parents who are looking for a supplement to homeschooling or private schooling. I do have, I have had a couple of public school students before. I do have a couple of students who have school during the week. And so we have a Socratic session on Saturday mornings. Um, so the idea is to supplement whatever it is that they're already doing. So and the aim is to teach them these skills, help them learn how to ask questions, how to ask meaningful questions in a way that leads to discovery. And so we talk about how they can, they can use this with their own classes. If they're, having to study out of a textbook and they're having a hard time understanding it, they can use these Socratic questions to really dig into it and understand it further. Or maybe their class didn't spend so much time on something that they really want to study more of. Well, these questions can take you out of the book, and you can go off on your own and discover these things for yourself. So yeah, it's really aimed at the seminars that I'm doing are a supplement to whatever coursework you're already doing. I am in the process, almost done, developing a course called Guiding Critical Thought, which is teaching parents and other teachers how to use the Socratic method in a classroom environment.
Kerry, is this instruction something that was just you identified with the Socratic method, thought this was a superior way of teaching and learning, and you're reconveying the Socratic method to students? Or is it an adapted method where, okay, I like a lot about what I'm seeing with the Socratic method, but we've come a long way in many areas, So is it modified, or would you say, oh, I'm going right to the old ways, and the old ways are the best ways?
I definitely think it's modified. I take a rather holistic approach to it. And I think anybody who does the Socratic method knows that everybody does it a little bit differently. I do look at this from a more holistic perspective. I'm much more self-taught, even in philosophy. One of the things that I learned about philosophy is that you teach yourself most of it. Um, but so I'm autodidactic by nature. Uh,
And what does
um,
that mean, autodidactic?
so literally means to self-instruct.
Okay.
Yeah. So and so what I'm teaching the kids is how to use this form of asking questions and digging deeper into a dialogue, into a conversation in order to learn whatever it is that you want to learn. That also includes talking to people you disagree with, right? Um, Even if and one of our lessons is going over manipulation, which is the wrong way to try and persuade somebody or to influence them. So we talk about the fact that um, this is an effort that's worth making, right? When you're talking to somebody you disagree with, either they know something you don't and you need to correct your view, maybe you're the one who's wrong, or they know something you don't and you need that information in order to improve
Mm.
your position. But either way, you need to listen, you need to ask questions, you need to have this dialogue.
That's I wish the university setting reflected what you just mentioned.
Mm,
Um, one of my frustrations with is that there is a level of manipulation,
hmm.
and I wouldn't say overt shaming, but there's a level of subtle shaming to not ask certain questions. And I love it when my students ask questions. To
Yeah.
me, it's an opportunity for me to make sure that we're connecting.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, even if you're a great orator and you've got a nice pace and rhythm to the way that you speak, and you're in love with your own lesson plan,
Yeah.
you have no idea how that's connecting with someone that's sitting there. I mean, you might think you do,
Yeah.
um, but it's the questions that help you figure out whether or not you're reaching people, and if they're confused, what a great opportunity.
Yeah.
So I kind of wish that I would see more of what you're describing in the university setting right now. Maybe that wasn't always the case. And even though I was in law school, we had the Socratic method, but I think that has changed
Mm,
in favor of a manipulated way of thinking about what the right legal philosophy is,
yeah.
as opposed to really drilling down and having that conversation. And I can't say that's the case with all of my professors, but it's become more and more apparent where, for example, most lawyers that graduate from law school
Hmm.
graduate embracing the living Constitution,
Oh, yeah.
or embracing positive law, as opposed to having a discussion of what we kind of kicked off this conversation going over, like natural law. The
Right.
idea
Right.
that there's a divine nature to humanity.
Hmm.
Do you have any examples of where you're seeing an absolute lack of critical thinking? And let me preface it this way: if you were to talk to people that watched the Super Bowl yesterday,
Yeah.
there's a level of critical thought and analysis in what the best strategy or game plan is.
Yeah.
Um, but when we talk about the things that we've been talking about, I don't see the same deep dive
Yeah.
into any of those discussions. So any areas that you think we need to improve critical thinking, or is that just a dumb question?
No, it's a great question. And I, there are a couple of areas. I actually, when I thought about this, and I list these on on my website, my courses website. There are 14, and there's probably more traits, but I have listed 14 traits of a critical thinker. that we aim to develop through the course. And these are really just traits that you develop as a critical thinker as you practice them more. I think that some areas that are sort of very imminent in necessity are, number one, intellectual humility. And what I have learned about the Socratic method, and what I would say is the proper way to use it, is that it starts from a place of ignorance. And Socrates, when he when he actually did his dialogues, right, he inspired the young people of Athens to actually start asking questions. So in one sense, he saw ignorance as or wonder as the beginning of knowledge. It was the beginning of learning something new. Um, but when he was dealing with people who thought they knew everything, they thought they were wise, he would use those questions and expose their ignorance. And really, I think he was exposing their pride. And it wasn't, I don't even think that Socrates necessarily, and I could be wrong about this because we don't know who Socrates the man really was, but I don't get the sense that he did that in a malicious sort of way. The felt effect of being humiliated and shown that you're ignorant when you thought you were really smart, that felt effect can really be humiliating. But his students, his followers, understood that they didn't know enough about the world. And Socrates himself didn't believe that he knew enough to teach anybody anything. And so, understanding that the more you learn, the more you learn about the world, the more you realize you don't know everything. And so you need people. Yeah, I don't know everything about law, David, so I need somebody like you.
Neither do I. Yeah.
So anyways, I think one is intellectual humility, and just being able to say I don't know. In school we're taught that I don't know is bad. You get marked with an X, you get docked points, your grade gets lower when you don't know the answer. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think I don't know is the compass rose of discovery. It's the compass rose of learning. It directs us. It tells us where we need to take our next steps.
It's also the compass rose of credibility.
Yes.
Because you can tell so quickly when people talk about something,
yeah,
or they have no clue. And
right.
I see this especially in politics.
Yeah.
Where the expectation is you have to be an expert on everything. It doesn't allow you to say, I don't know. And you'll never see your mainstream politicians say, I don't know. Never. Yeah. And what a terrible place to be, because what pressure that puts on you.
Right.
To be a know-it-all.
And now we have this expectation that experts really do know it all. I mean, right now we're treating doctors as demigods. No, we don't know everything. And even if you're a practiced thinker, if you're not even a practice, if you are an accomplished thinker, I talk about the 6 stages of thinking. Accomplished is the highest level of thinking you can achieve. That doesn't mean you know everything.
This is important, Kerry. Can you give us just rattle off the 6 if you have them in front of you?
Yeah. So the 6 stages of thinking, first of all, everybody's a thinker. Some of us think better than others. The first stage is the unreflective thinker. So this is the thinker who's going about his daily business doing things, but isn't thinking about his own thoughts and whether he's thinking well about them. The next stage is the challenge thinker. This is the thinker who suddenly becomes aware that maybe they are wrong about something. This is where you get a lot of emotional responses. When I say challenge thinker, you're challenged. And if you don't embrace that challenge, you go back to being an unreflective thinker.
So if we're talking about some of the challenges over policy with respect to COVID, or wearing a mask, or election fraud, I've waded into that, or into these other areas. It's not to say that someone can't be right or someone can't be wrong, but do you see that the population that we're interfacing with are primarily in that challenged thinker and
Yeah.
unreflective thinker stages?
Yeah. So
Okay.
yeah, a challenge thinker is feeling an emotional response from the possibility that they're wrong. Because if you haven't come to understand how being wrong is actually a useful tool for you, that feels like an attack on your person, on your very being, because you have formulated these opinions, and but you haven't been reflective in the way you formulated those opinions, and they are a part of who you are. And so when we're challenged, we have this emotional reaction, and we're
Mm.
either going to accept the challenge and challenge ourselves to think about those things, or we're going to rebuff it and go back to the unreflective thinker
The
stage.
reason why I stopped you on those 6 stages is because I looked at some of your work, and this was very helpful for me in,
Hmm.
I guess, marshaling my own emotions in how I engage with people, because I
Yeah.
did a lot of work on studying evidence, and everyone that attacked me on me being dumb or not being out of lockstep with the quote unquote experts from different news media agencies, I would send them the evidence, and they would never look at it. Even if
Hmm.
they asked for it, I think they're calling my bluff just to see if I had it.
Hmm.
And then two, they wouldn't engage with the evidence. When you study hundreds of cases, it's like, where do you want to start? You want to have a good faith discussion. Let's talk about this state and this county, and
Hmm.
let's engage.
Yeah.
Because if I'm wrong, I want to know. Because again, like you said, I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be humiliated that somehow.
Right.
Um, and that's presented challenges too with making sure that you keep that intellectual humility.
Hmm.
Because just because I did some research and I've come to a conclusion doesn't necessarily mean that in the end analysis that I'm going to be completely right.
Right.
And so you want to continue to reflect and ensure that you're living a life where you're more right than wrong. And you have the humility to admit that, okay, I need to recalibrate
Yeah.
my analysis because I've been challenged, and that's good because who wants to walk in ignorance?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, most of my invitations um, to look at things together
Hmm.
have been declined. So
Mm.
that's one of my observations, and your stages was helpful for me to go, okay, you
Yeah.
can't be upset with someone if they don't want to get to the next stage, which is what?
Right. Okay. So the third stage is the beginner thinker. So this is the thinker who has finally started reflecting on their own thoughts. They realize that they have some errors in their thinking. They want to start learning how to think more critically. And so then the fourth stage is the practice thinker. So this is the thinker who has started to learn some skills. They've started to learn some of the strategies. They don't practice or they don't think on a regular basis. They don't critically think on a regular basis. It hasn't become a regular part of everyday life. But they are actively aware of their thoughts. They are actively pursuing self improvement in that area. Then stage 5 is the advanced thinker. This is the thinker that doesn't just think about the tough questions. They actively, critically think in all of the significant areas of life. So, maybe they start critically thinking about their own health and how to improve their own health. And they start reflecting on, their body and the way they're eating and perhaps options for, healthcare and that sort of thing. Um, and so the advanced thinker is doing that on a much more regular basis. They have a strategy for self improvement. They've already developed some of these intellectual traits, like they've got a greater degree of intellectual humility. It's not necessarily across the board or perfect. And then you have the accomplished thinker. And most people never become an accomplished thinker, but this is, you might imagine somebody like Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, who's, in his library all day and is really a focused thinker on everything. It's much more intuitive to him because he's practiced it or because she's practiced it so much. The reality is that most people can graduate out of high school as unreflective thinkers, and teachers don't know how to identify these stages of thinking. They are often unreflective thinkers themselves. If you are practiced enough, maybe you're an active critical thinker, maybe you're a homeschooler or a private schooler, and your kids have been actively pursuing critical thinking, your kids are not likely to graduate as advanced or accomplished thinkers because they still have some frontal lobe development to go through, which doesn't complete until your mid-20s. So, pursuing critical thinking is a lifelong endeavor. And certainly learning these skills younger when you are developing will give you a head start in life. Nothing says you can't start now. It all starts with that, with that intellectual humility. And I do want to say one thing. There's another area that I think is very critical for people. And this is an area, I didn't have a word for this until I came across an article from a PhD psychologist by the name of Reber. I think it's Rob or Rod Reber. He calls it critical feeling. That challenged thinker stage where we've just been attacked, our beliefs have just been attacked, and we're having this emotional response. We have to know how to process through that. And we have to know how to use our feelings as a tool. Our emotions, our sensations, our sense experiences are there for a reason. And so we have to be able to, this is an exercise that I do with my students. We talk about how our feelings are connected to our thoughts. Ben Shapiro is infamous for saying that facts don't care about your feelings, but guess what? Your feelings do care about the facts. And so we have to know how to process through our emotions. Otherwise, you're never even going to get to the beginner stage of thinking if you aren't willing to understand how your emotions work.
Well, I've got two observations on what you just shared. First one is, I know for a fact I am not an accomplished thinker. And I think the reason why I know that I'm not is that when you come across truly life-changing thinkers, and you mentioned C.S. Lewis or Tolkien as examples, they are so original.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think Jordan Peterson talks about this too, that before you dare try to rip off the great thinkers, and I have to be very conscious that I don't rip off people that I've been influenced with. Mm-hmm. There's this idea that you need to add to the discussion. You need to not only add to it, personalize how they've affected you, mm-hmm. and then integrate it into who you are. So when you speak, you're not just scoring intellectual blows where mm-hmm. you can recite facts, and you can see a lot of people that are very smart, or they can memorize a lot of things, and they're really good at just throwing facts, but they're not tethered to anything. They're not tethered to,
right.
It's like a game for them.
Yeah.
And that's really difficult to have a discussion with someone who's so intelligent and so gifted at recalling facts, but the facts aren't integrated into who they are as a person. And it's a facade. And if you stick around long enough, you will start to see that facade crack. Mm-hmm. And so, who knows, one day I might get into that category. I would love to get in that category, but I would even say that the same thing with great theologians. Jonathan Edwards mm-hmm. would be someone that if you've read his work, it's like, how in the world did you think this up? And then you'll have other gifted preachers that would never be able to articulate mm-hmm. from an original standpoint those thoughts, but they're good conveyors of what they've learned, and they can tell you about the lessons. And then the other, I guess, observation from what you're talking about is that I think this is so helpful if people would turn the scalpel towards themselves as a self-diagnostic, because it's not about winning.
Right.
And that's the problem with art, with people
Yeah.
that like to debate. I don't even like the word debate because it denotes that you need to win.
Hmm.
And well, what an unrefined thing. And you can actually apply this to personal relationships.
Yep.
If I'm married, and this was a huge breakthrough for me. The idea of fights where you need to win an argument, but at the end result, the person that you're with feels weaker and
Hmm.
less loved. Like, how have you won exactly? Because you need to wake up the next day with this person, and do you want them to be a shell of themselves, or do you want them to flourish?
Right.
And so if we approach these discussions, whether it's election fraud, politics, whether to wear a mask, whether to how to have a debate on abortion, or the right church to go to, all of these super important things, we have to get away from this idea that we need to win the argument,
Hmm.
but rather to reason and wrestle and contend with one another to arrive at some truth that allows everyone to see that they can actually flourish more as a result of having the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's just missing so much. And I think what you're sharing, Carrie, really helps give a language
Hmm.
um, to to be able to better articulate when people aren't in a certain stage.
Hmm.
Um, and so at this point, we've been at it for about an hour and 35, maybe 40 minutes.
Yeah.
So I won't keep any longer unless you have the time. Um, but let me just say this. I just want to thank you for uh, sharing some of your thoughts on um, maybe maybe how we can better converse with one another.
Yeah.
I've learned a ton. There are some other questions that I wanted to ask, and perhaps I'll just throw them out there,
Okay.
and we can maybe continue this conversation down the road, or not. I'll leave it to you. I want to be conscious of your time.
Thanks.
Um, a lot of folks would are curious about the future of how do we advocate for liberty from a
Hmm.
broad standpoint. I would include in that discussion what we've just been talking about, how to have a discourse that doesn't require legal force,
Hmm.
legislation. Like, I want to convince you to my side of things, and I think it's very libertarian.
Hmm.
Um, so the future of political parties and advocacy of liberty going forward, and then whether you have any hope for the future with respect to whether you think we'll see a greater enlightenment on how to have a conversation. So if you have any final thoughts on those two subjects, I would love to hear them from you.
Yeah. Well, I I dropped any partisan loyalties that I had many, many years ago. Gosh, it must have been 2012. I finally dropped any party loyalties that I had. I'm not even a member of the Libertarian Party. Um,
Hmm.
I think I think as far as partisan politics are concerned, we're at this point where we kind of need to, in my opinion, um, uh, really get back to sort of a first things sort of mentality. What is the proper role of governance? Um, Government has interjected itself into every area of our life, and we're very accustomed to it to the point of not even thinking about it. So, what is that role? What are our rights? Are they important? How do we know what they are? Um, I think it's time we have that conversation. It's been too much, red versus blue, blue versus red, which team is winning, and all of that nonsense. And now we're just turning tribalistic, which is crazy. Look, we are all human beings. We all care about people. We all have things that are important to us. We don't all agree. But I think the world would be pretty boring if we all agreed. What makes humanity wonderful is the dynamic complexity of all of our differences coming together in this spontaneous way. That's beautiful, and it's getting shut down by this idea that we all have to think alike and join in lockstep with one another. We don't need to view our disagreements as making enemies, drawing lines in the sand, and that sort of thing. As far as hope in the future, I mean, first of all, my hope is in Christ. My hope isn't in the government trying, finally figuring itself out. My hope is not that we will suddenly find utopia. My hope is in Christ, but I do also believe in the individual. I believe that as image bearers of God, we have unique attributes that can really make a wonderful and peaceable world. We are capable of that, and so I don't want to deny that either. Um, I think that there is reason to hope, but we have, I would say, some hard work in front of us, and building some of that intellectual humility and willingness to listen and ask questions from a genuine standpoint instead of just trying to win an argument.
I appreciate those comments and your thoughts on it. I think I'm close to where you are, especially with the political stuff. I've always thought that parties were kind of necessary evils in the sense that if you want to wield change, it's an avenue. And I don't even think it's the best avenue, but it's an avenue to maybe defend yourself from government. And sometimes you have to have that voice. And so in many respects, someone like Ron Paul to me no one would accuse him of being a terrific legislator
Right.
from laws created and passed, but he was a wonderful watchman that could tell and tattle whenever there was a threat to liberty. And that to me was always what made him so attractive is if we want to preserve liberty, how do we warn the populace of encroaching laws that are bad for us? And so I've never been someone that necessarily felt like the Republican Party defined me. In many ways, I actually identify with a lot of my good friends are Democrats. And that may surprise some, but the folks that know me, it's not surprising at all because I actually share a lot of their concerns about the ills of the world.
Yep.
Where we disagree is how you solve those problems.
Right.
But the empathy in the heart, I completely identify with.
Yeah.
And then there are legitimate critiques on the Libertarian Party, which I've called home. But I have problems as someone who, and I think you hit on this earlier, the lack of tying itself to any ethic that would cultivate a sense that we should actually try to make the world a better place. And it's not to say that you don't have the choice to do that. They'll always tell you have the choice. But I think the stereotype of libertarianism has always been, it's naive, it's always self-centered, it's more libertine than libertarian. And I mentioned this with Jason during last week's talk, was that Christians are able to enter that space in a really cool way because it answers the largest critiques, which is we're actually called to be other-centered. And we're called to go into the world and redress hurts and love people. And so, but the answer isn't provided by being a part of the right political party. It's actually as an individual through our faith. And perhaps that's a conversation for another night. This idea of, it's really cool to talk to a libertarian who's a Christian, because on the one hand, we're saying, this is my own property, this is my own ownership. Yet our faith kind of tweaks that a little bit, because there are claims about what we do with our life and with our bodies that we submit to through our faith.
Yes.
And so that I want to maybe revisit with you on that subject down the road, because I think that's a discussion that many libertarians and Christians aren't having. And as far as hope for the future, I hope that we can have another talk real soon, Kerry. So with that, I'm going to end tonight. You've been so generous with your time. I hope
can I interject just one
Sure,
little
sure.
thought? Because you did mention, you know, how Christians, how do we think about this idea of self-ownership, especially when, you know we are not our own, right? We're bought with a price. We belong to God. And so we do have this concept that God owns us. And it is, I would say, a fact. God owns us. So how do we reconcile that?
Mm.
Um, and I would say that a Christian libertarian perspective is specific on self-ownership is specifically this. In relation to God, he's given us a stewardship over our lives, but we are owned by him.
Mm.
He's given us a stewardship, but in relation, you and I, in relation to one another, that stewardship means that I own myself and you own yourself. But it's never alone, right? We have a responsibility to God. We have that stewardship relationship.
That
But
makes sense, especially when
yeah.
you're talking about the very breath or air that we breathe,
Hmm.
the minds that we are bestowed with or not given to enter into the world. They're
Right.
all gifts,
Yes.
and there's times where I wish that God increased my capacity in some areas over others. But yeah, I think that's very helpful.
Yeah.
So, Kerry, anything else that you'd share with whatever audience this video finds? And I will certainly provide links to Kerry's work. You need to check it out. All of you folks that want to get better at thinking, I am a student of Kerry's, and I will continue to follow her work because it's been very helpful for me. But Kerry, thank you so much for
Thank
spending
you.
this evening with me.
Yeah, this has been fun. Thank you for inviting me on.
All right, Kerry, good night.
Good night.